Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies, and in this episode, we're going to look at advanced weathering effects, including dirt, dust, rusting, and chipping. If you like learning about building a miniature, please remember to subscribe. Nothing makes your models look better than weathering. You can have a very neatly painted subject, but if it does not look like it belongs in a time and a place, then something about it will just look off. In a previous episode, we looked at basic weathering methods, and we used acrylic paints to dry brush on the effects. This is good for wargaming and for something that isn't a centerpiece, but now we're going to look at more complex methods. There are roughly 5 components to the model weathering process. There's pre-dusting, pigments, chipping, rusting, and washing. Now, none of these are really distinct from each other or even necessary. If I want to produce a model that has a really pristine look, like it's new off the factory floor, then obviously I'm going to skip chipping. If the model is supposed to be a space station floating in outer space, obviously there's going to be no dust. Also, there is no proper defined sequence for weathering. I often do chipping after pigments, though in real-world terms this makes little sense, because dust will sit on top of damaged paint the same as pristine paint. It all comes down to the subject. While working in 1/100 scale, I often add the chips last and in an exaggerated way so they stand out. On a 1/35 scale model, obviously that would look weird. This is where the advanced notion applies. The techniques are fundamentally easy to apply, but only experience with your chosen scale will inform you on what works. My advice over this is not to be intimidated. The sooner you get learning, the better it will be. And don't expect mastery. The point is to push yourself and broaden your horizons, not absolute perfection. Because like many things in life, when painting models, the top of the pyramid really just doesn't exist. So let's take a look at the weathering process in depth. When we have a model that's ready for weathering, we usually start with pre-dusting. That is, applying a light tone of dust or dirt to the model in the areas where we expect to see the weathering. In this case, I'm using sand paint and giving a gentle coat to this M109 Paladin by Battlefront. The point is to add a subtle hint of accumulated dust. Also, an airbrush, though it's a good idea, isn't necessary. You could dry brush this just as well. Don't try to make this step too bold. Keep it subtle. It's a foundation for the steps that are about to follow. With the area defined by pre-dusting, it's time to get dirty and use the pigments. There are fundamentally 2 types of pigments, wet and dry. In this example, I'm going to use both. Here I start with Dust and Dirt Deposits by AK Interactive. This is a wet pigment. Basically, it's a pigment suspended in a thinner medium. When it dries, it comes out a dark matte color. Because of its dark color, I apply it near the bottom of the pre-dusted areas, where the dirt is more likely to be wetter. I also slop it onto the tracks and road wheels. I don't so much paint it as I dab it on. After this, I move on to the dry pigments. These are just dry dusts that you can apply to your model with a brush. I take my time dabbing it on in some places and brushing it on in others. I go with a less is more kind of approach because you can always add more dry pigments later. I also use several colors, trying to get the lighter tones higher on the pre-dusted areas and the darker tones lower towards the wetter parts. When this is done, you have to remember that the pigments aren't fixed to the model. It's really just a dust sitting on the surface. So I take some thinner and dab it onto the surface where the pigments are sitting. It'll help bind them there. In some spots, I'll try to do streaks downwards as well, and I also let it accumulate in spots around raised details such as tire rims and hatches. You always need to wait for the thinner to dry, then you inspect your results. If you don't like what you're seeing, just go over it again with more thinner, and you can do this several times until you're happy with what you've got. So as I was stating before, there is no specific order to these techniques, and here I decide to do some washes, or more specifically, pin washes. I won't get a lot into the details of how to do washing because I cover it more in some of my other videos, and it's an integral part to shading your models. But here I decide that the pigments had eliminated some of the definition in the model. So I take some enamel dark wash and, thinning it down, apply it in a targeted way with a fine brush. I let the capillary action draw the enamels in, and this helps return the definition by building artificial shadow around raised details such as rivets. When I'm doing weathering or any painting in general, from time to time I may just go back and rewash an area with an enamel when I think it needs to get its definition rebuilt. Now I go ahead and start chipping. With a lot of scale model painters, they'll paint a large number of chips in a lot of sizes, ranging from very small to pretty big. Then they'll weather over it. Well, we work in 1/100 scale, and so chips can really overpower the result. So it's better to make a few really large obvious chips to build interest, as opposed to a whole bunch of them. And I usually do them after the pigments so they stand out. Now I get asked about this technique a lot, but it's actually really easy. The key is to think of the model as a canvas on which you're going to add a new type of art in the form of the chips themselves. Just remember, at 1/100 scale, or 15mm scale, you're after visual interest, not realism. So I start by mixing up a lighter middle tone of the model's main paint color. In this case, a green mixed with white paint. Then I use a small brush and paint dots and scratches on the surface where I think the wear is likely to occur, and really just where I think it might look good. I keep these details big enough that I can paint inside them. Now I move to a finer brush and get out some rust red or dark brown paint. I then paint inside the previous dots and scratches to imply deeper damage to the paintwork. Again, don't get carried away. You need a balance at this scale. When this is done, the dark on light colors will create an appearance of depth. And that's it. Your chipping process is done. This brings us to rust. Rust can take on a lot of forms and colors, but I prefer to keep it subtle, and as always, I favor enamel paints for this. I use two products, both by AK Interactive, Crusted Rust Deposits and Light Rust Wash. First I put down crusted rust, which is almost a dark pink, and I apply it where the rust should mainly be at its thickest. Specifically, I target over large chips that I just painted. Then I go over this with light rust. Sometimes I'll apply light rust on its own too, where I don't want a big rust accumulation, or I just want to apply a simple streak. When this is done, I take thinner and go back to blend the rust, softening the edges and drawing it into streaks on vertical surfaces. And that's all there is to it. It's not a complex technique, but it adds some really nice tones of color to models that can sometimes be sort of a boring brown or green. So there you have it, the weathering is done. All you need to do is finish up any detail painting and hit the model with a couple coats of matte varnish. And please don't skip the varnish step, because in this case it's needed to make sure the dust, dirt, and rust tones stay a flat color. These things aren't glossy in real life, and they won't look proper if they're not absolutely matte on the finished model. Also, if you use pigments, it'll help bind them better so you don't wear them off handling the model. And this is especially important if you're a wargamer. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is growing. Please stay tuned for new content twice weekly on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We're your source for regular model building, miniature painting, and diorama content. If you have not subscribed, make sure you do, and press the bell button to receive immediate notification so you do not miss out. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is a Patreon account. There are many interesting rewards for our patrons. If Patreon isn't your thing, consider visiting my Etsy store. Many of the pieces of terrain I show in the videos are for sale there. And don't forget the 20% off coupon, which is available into May 1st, 2021. Proceeds benefit the channel and help us produce regular content for you. The links are in the video description. Thanks for watching, and until next time, remember to keep building life in miniature.